Hello, everyone. This is Lauren Steiner. Welcome to tonight's edition of The Robust Opposition. I am bringing in Dan Cohen. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Lauren. Good to be with you.
He wrote a really great article for the Grayzone project, and he is also a reporter for RT. Establishment Democrats are going to discount you because they're going to say, oh, RT. Didn't RT have to register as a Russian agent? So why don't you tell us a little bit about RT and your own background, your own journalistic credentials?
Okay. Well, I started working for RT about a year ago, and that was because RT was basically the only outlet that would have me on prior to, before, when I was working on the ground in Israel-Palestine for about 3 years. I worked independently. I had I also worked for part of the time, I worked for a website called Maddow, and I was doing dispatches from the ground in the Gaza Strip a lot, around Jerusalem. And RT was the one channel that would let me on to speak freely. And I think it says a lot about establishment media in the U.S., whether it's MSNBC, CNN, Fox, whatever, that you can't criticize Israel. And so I found RT was like, wow, I can actually talk openly, and they didn't vet what I was going to say, which I know a lot of people who go on CNN and these channels, and they give you a pre-interview before they allow you to do the interview. So if they don't like the angle you're going to come with, they'll can your appearance. But we don't do that at RT. And not that RT isn't without its flaws, but my experience there has been very positive. I have total editorial freedom. I write everything I say. What people imagine about RT is it's just not the reality, that it's like, Putin is controlling us, telling us what to say, disseminating talking points. Actually, largely, Artie America is what I work for. So there's 4 different channels. Actually, I believe 5 now. There's Artie America, Artie International, there's Artie Spanish, there's Artie Arabic, and now there's Artie French. And they all are kind of different. There's not like one, single unified line. And there's a lot of different opinions, even within, Artie America or any of the different channels. So, it's a pretty a good place to work, I find, and I'm allowed to have editorial independence, which really you can't ask for. That's the best thing, the most important thing in journalism.
Yeah, a lot of people like Cenk Uygur, when he was with MSNBC, he talked about how they really scripted what he had to write. And of course, Ed Schultz was fired from MSNBC after he started promoting Bernie Sanders and criticizing the TPP. And of course, we know Phil Donahue was fired when he criticized the Iraq War. And if anyone out there has not seen the documentary Control Room, which is about Al Jazeera, I suggest they see it, because very similarly, although Al Jazeera is controlled by Qatar, everybody who works there is a professional journalist. And I found, I discovered RT and also Press TV, which is the Iran state media, when I was with Occupy LA. And I found that both of those entities covered Occupy a lot more and a lot more fairly than did the mainstream media. They made fun of us. They derided us. Maybe the goal, obviously, of these countries is to show dissent in America. But shouldn't it be the goal of our media to also show dissent, as opposed to agreeing or being, like, as we call them, stenographers for the corporate state?
Right, exactly. That's a very democratic thing, is to have a variety of voices and opinions, and allow all of them within I think reasonable limits. Like I don't really want to see Nazis, for instance, on TV, but at the same time, I don't think that the way to defeat them is to censor them. But that's another story. Obviously, RT, it's largely going to be and not exclusively going to be in line with Russia's foreign with Russia's line, obviously, but that's kind of a given. Just like if I were watching Press TV, I would know that that's going to largely represent the policies of Iran, or Al Jazeera with Qatar. But I find that I tend to agree with much of Russia's foreign policy. Domestic politics, not as much, but I'm not reporting on Russia's domestic politics. I'm an American, and I want to talk about what America is doing in this country. And basically, if you're anti-war, if you're against empire, you're totally pushed out of establishment media in this country. You'll notice if you watch MSNBC or CNN or any of these channels, there's no room for dissent. It's all constant warmongering and praising and kind of this cult around like John Brennan and Robert Mueller and all of these spies and killers and really who are just kind of the worst of the swamp.
Yeah,
that's why I work at RT.
Yeah, and I find it interesting that they make them register as a Russian agent. I mean, we're not in a war. We're not in a war with them. They don't make the BBC or Agence France Presse register as Russian agents. They're just simply the news outlet of the foreign government, correct?
Yeah, they don't even make AIPAC register as a foreign agent, which, I mean, that's completely what AIPAC is, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. I mean, that is the main component of the Israel lobby. And so, I think what it really shows that, well, first I'll explain what the Foreign Agent Registration Act was in late 2017, November, I believe. Yes, in November 2017, under threat of arrest, the DOJ said RT's head, our head of programming, has to register as a foreign agent. Now, that part about threat of arrest was that wasn't even really reported. Oh, it was just like, oh, he just went down to the DOJ, turned in some paperwork, no big deal. But they threatened a media agency to arrest them, which, I mean, you can only imagine if the Russians threatened to arrest like the head of Voice of America, like, the American propaganda outlet in Russia, how big of a scandal that would be. But that was left out of all the stories here. And it was on a totally phony basis of the ODNI report, the Director of National Intelligence, saying that Russia had meddled in the election. And if you examine the report that they released in January 2017, a lot of it was actually years before the election, and it was with shows like Abby Martin's Breaking the Set, which was an excellent show on RT that basically provided space for dissident voices. And it accused Abby Martin and her show of fomenting radical discontent, was the words the DOJ used. So, I mean, it was for covering Occupy, as you said. It was for covering the No DAPL protests. And this is the stuff that you'll never see on CNN. So really, it's just about suppressing dissent. And it's an attack on free speech is really what it should be understood as, an attack on the Constitution. And really, it's very worrying that this has been totally accepted by the mainstream in this country.
So before we go into your article, let's talk a little bit about the Grayzone project and why Max Blumenthal started that, and also why you, who are Jewish, let's make this clear, because so many people think we Jews support everything that the government of Israel does. And, there's certain people on our side that try to conflate being against Israel with being anti-Semitic, which means I guess I'm a self-hating Jew. So talk about that. Talk about your viewpoints and Max's and the orientation of the investigative unit.
Well, I mean, in terms of being, a Jewish anti-Zionist, I come from a proud tradition of that, or at least I'd like to think I'm a part of a proud tradition. I wasn't raised. I was raised to be pro-Israel. I had my bar mitzvah in Israel, and I was raised with kind of liberal values. I grew up in a suburb of Phoenix, mostly secular, and then I went on. I don't know. I found that what I was told about Israel, that it's this kind of like, amazing democracy where everyone's welcome, and it's also like a homeland for Jews, and it's just this great place. I went there on birthright, and I just found it to be totally the opposite, that it was just this like kind of convenience store of racism. It was just the most racist place I've ever been, where if you expressed any sympathy or sympathy for Palestinians living under occupation, or you question the official narrative at all, you're kind of cast out. And so I basically felt like I was lied to, and so that just made me angry. And after some years of being not sure what I was going to do, for work and finishing college, I decided I'm just going to go headfirst into journalism, and I bought a plane ticket. I went over there, and a few months later, I was in the Gaza Strip, and I was working with Max Blumenthal. And then we made this documentary, which we released last year. It's called Killing Gaza. And it was over about a 3-year period that I was there, or 2-year period, I should say, in 6.5 months. Over a 6.5 months, over a 2-year period, I was in the Gaza Strip documenting the 2014 war, Operation Protective Edge, which killed about 2,200 Palestinians. And I documented the aftermath, the war and the aftermath, and we released it on Vimeo as this documentary, Killing Gaza. So you can see it at killinggaza.com. $3 to rent it, $5 to buy it. We tried to make it, as affordable as possible. And so around then is when Max founded the Grayzone project, initially as a vehicle for fighting Islamophobia. The Grayzone is a term that ISIS, an ISIS propagandist use, saying that the Grayzone is basically coexistence between Muslims and the West, and ISIS had to destroy the Grayzone. So the idea was to protect this concept of coexistence, and then that kind of expanded into fighting empire, which Islamophobia is very much part of empire, and it's a way that it pushes empire using Islamophobia. And so over the years, it's kind of, the mission has kind of evolved to counter empire and disinformation. And in the age of, in the Trump presidency, really a lot of it has been, much of it has been countering all the propaganda we hear about to hype up the new Cold War, about Russia and China and all these, foreign countries that are supposedly our enemies, if we listen to the establishment. And so in addition to my work at RT, my daily work there, I find time to write at Grayzone Project periodically.
Well, I want to talk about this article, but first I want to give an intro to the viewers as to how I found out about this. I thought I was really coming up with a great investigative find on my own, but it turns out Dan was working on this all along. I'm sitting there, and I guess it's November, and I'm hearing this person by the name of Renee DiResta on NPR. She's being interviewed by NPR, and she comes from this company called New Knowledge, and they had provided testimony to the Senate Intelligence Committee with Mark Warner and, I guess Richard Burr is the leader of the committee, and then Mark Warner is the ranking member from the Democrats. And they're just basically talking about all this Russian disinformation, that Russians are buying and sharing posts on Black Lives Matter and fracking and all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, wait a minute. I share those posts. Those posts are not by Russians. They're by like legitimate activists and people who support Black Lives Matter and are fighting fracking. And I'm like, I got to see what these people are all about. And I forgot, I couldn't find it at first under New Knowledge. And then I heard her again, like a month later. So I go home, I Google it, and it turns out it's this company that specializes in Russian disinformation, but they're selling their services. So that kind of tipped me off that something is amiss here, that they actually profit from people believing that the Russians are trying to deceive us. And so I remember at that point just direct messaging or maybe Facebook messaging Aaron Maddow, who investigates this kind of stuff, and say, can you look into this? And literally 2 days later, I read Dan's article, and I contacted him and I said, you've got to come on, my show and talk about this. First of all, what was this bombshell report that was hailed by Mark Warner and Richard Burr at the Senate Intelligence Committee?
Right. So there were 2 reports that the Senate Intelligence Committee actually commissioned, and they outsourced. Now, normally the Senate Intelligence Committee would do it themselves, but they actually outsourced the research and writing of these 2 reports to these companies, one of which is what you said, New Knowledge. Now, New Knowledge is basically as you described, a for-profit company that finds Russian disinformation wherever it looks. Now, the majority of the work they do is actually in the private sector. So, if you're like an oil company, or if you do oil and gas, and you have some like pesky anti-fracking activists, criticizing you online, you just go to New Knowledge, hire them, and then they say, oh, these are Russian bots, so they're totally illegitimate, which is exactly what you just described. That's the majority of what they do. Now but the Senate intelligence reports that they wrote, which Mark Warner described as a bombshell. These things, if you read Aaron Mate's actually excellent examination in The Nation, he wrote this for The Nation, of what these reports say, it's really, there's very little to it. They basically claim that the Internet Research Agency, which is a Russian troll farm that makes clickbait for profit, is behind this, massive disinformation operation. And basically and they did it through, Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and Pokemon Go. And it's kind of absurd on its face. But if you examine this stuff, as Aaron Mate did, it turns out 11% of the content that they claim is even related, that they claim Russia used, the Internet Research Agency used for its disinformation campaign, 11% of it is even related to the election. And then a minuscule amount of that even mentions any of the candidates. And like the most popular Instagram post was something like, if you like, click if you like Jesus. There was the other like big Facebook post, I think, was like Yosemite Sam. And it's just the most asinine post that, we're told by New Knowledge and the Senate Intelligence Committee that, this is what's infiltrating our brains and getting people to vote for Trump. And it really just shows that they think voters are stupid. And there's just total, like, this elite contempt for everyday Americans, for voters who are, disenfranchised with the kind of neoliberal status quo and Hillary Clinton, and, maybe wanted an alternative in either Bernie Sanders, a candidate like that, which is, who certainly I voted for, and I'm guessing everyone watching this voted for, or if you, went for the snake oil and voted for Trump, people like that too, who, just saw right through Hillary Clinton's lies, one way or the other. So the report was just a total scam, and it was New Knowledge who was behind one of them.
Right. Why don't you tell us about the founders of New Knowledge, this Jonathan Morgan, the other guy, Fox, and also Renee DiResta?
Jonathan Morgan is the co-founder of New Knowledge. He is a veteran of the Obama administration. He was an advisor to the White House and the Obama State Department. He's kind of worked his way up through the national security apparatus to found New Knowledge, along with Ryan Fox. Ryan Fox spent, I believe, 15 years in the NSA, the National Security Agency. So he is a spy. He's a bona fide spy. He spent his time spying on people around the world, and probably, you can bet, American citizens as well. And so then that qualified him, along with Morgan, to start this company, New Knowledge, a few years ago. And then in the time of the Trump presidency, this is kind of, they've basically gotten $11 million investment from venture capitalists in August 2017. And that really, brought them, a huge amount of money, and allowed them to hire all kinds of people and come up with all kinds of these disinformation campaigns. And they were essentially able to position themselves as one of the leading firms, in the whole, like, pointing at Russian bots everywhere, as I said, primarily for private corporations. And so that's what qualified them to do this Senate Intelligence Committee report. And they hired Renee DiResta, who's also a veteran of the Obama administration and is basically a disinformation expert. She has a really bizarre manifesto that I read. I can send the link, you can post it, but she basically explains that we're not even in a Cold War, we're in a warm war, and this is like all out an information world war.
I know. I couldn't believe the things that were coming out of her mouth. They were so inflammatory. And doesn't she also have a Wall Street background?
Yes, she was. Yep, exactly. She worked on Wall Street for a while. So, you know, real. She's really of the people. You know, really one of us. And so she was actually tasked with overseeing this whole phony report, the operation. Exactly.
So now, do they ever reveal what their methods are, what their evidence is? Do they show it to the Senate Intelligence Committee or any of the mainstream media, the stenographers for the corporate state that just merely repeat this stuff? Do you know what their evidence is?
Well, New Knowledge says its method for identifying Russian disinformation is a little bit shaky. It's not exactly perfect. It hasn't been perfected. And one of the things, there's a great foreign policy write-up. It's like a fluff piece on New Knowledge, and it interviews one of their analysts. And it says, well, it does, you know, it has some problems. They're still working it out. And one of the things it sometimes does is it mistakes people who criticize U.S. foreign policy for Kremlin trolls. So, you know, if you have a problem, yeah, exactly. So, like, if you're one of, I think it's something like 60% of Americans think the war in Afghanistan was a terrible idea now. So, according to New Knowledge, you're a Russian bot. Or, you know, if you think troops should be withdrawn from Syria, you're a Russian bot. So, you know, basically most Americans are Russian bots, according to New Knowledge. Now, they really don't say what their methodology actually is. But one of the things they refer to, and this is across the media, if you look in MSNBC or CNN, any of the mainstream outlets, they talk about this thing called the Hamilton 68 dashboard, right, which is a project of what's called the Alliance for Securing Democracy, which is funded essentially through a cutout of the U.S. government. So the U.S. government is giving funding to what's called the German Marshall Fund, which gives money to the Alliance for Securing Democracy to create the Hamilton 68 dashboard. If you're following along, I know this is complicated, but essentially the U.S. government, through a series of cutouts, funds the Hamilton 68 dashboard, and the Hamilton 68 dashboard claims to track 600 Russian accounts to create Russian influence. These accounts. But it doesn't say what the accounts are. So there's no way of verifying that this is actually what it is. And if you look at who is on the board of this, the board of directors, one of them is Bill Kristol, the famous Project for a New American Century neocon, who's one of the most vociferous proponents of the war on Iraq. And so now this whole project is basically aimed at agitating towards Russia and hyping up the new Cold War in order to get weapons contractors money and just keep the whole show going. Now, Jonathan Morgan, the CEO of New Knowledge, was part of the design team for Hamilton 68. He actually helped create this like phony bot tracker, and that's one of the things he says. New Knowledge. That's what he says. New Knowledge uses to track Russian bots.
Well, this is just another example of neoliberalism, where a government function is farmed out to a private company whose main goal is to make money. And therefore, the function that they're doing is going to benefit their bottom line and not the people, which is to find out if there really is any Russian disinformation. So we'll talk more about that in a little while. But this story takes a very interesting turn with the Roy Moore, Doug Jones campaign, where we find out that New Knowledge, not only are they a fraud, but they actually engaged in the very disinformation that they accused Russia of doing. And Jonathan Morgan ended up having his Facebook account suspended. So why don't you tell us what happened there and who broke that story and why he's been questioned? Right.
So this is basically these hucksters who, wrote this Senate Intelligence Committee report, that Mark Warner called a bombshell. And it came out in the New York Times that they actually ran, in their own words, a false flag operation, an elaborate false flag operation in the Alabama Senate race in December 2017. It was actually a 5-month operation, started August through December of 2017. That race was to replace Jeff Sessions, who had been nominated by Trump at that time to head the DOJ. And so you had this race between Roy Moore, the Christian theocrat pedophile, accused pedophile, and then Doug Jones, the kind of centrist, corporate, neoliberal Democrat who just had no appeal. So two very unpopular candidates. And so what New Knowledge did is run a false flag operation, which involved buying several thousand Twitter bots and then putting their bios, their name and bio in Cyrillic, in the Russian language alphabet, having them follow Roy Moore on Twitter, and then going to media and say, oh, look, Roy Moore is suddenly followed by all these Russian bots, therefore he is Kremlin-backed. And that story went viral. It was all over the place, and it actually hurt Roy Moore. Now that was
Mother Jones, the real Mother Jones, would be turning in her grave if she saw what happened to her publication that has her name. Didn't they breathlessly repeat this as well?
Yes, exactly. They ran with this story and actually used it even for fundraising to say, look at this incredible reporting we're doing about, how this pervert Roy Moore is backed by the Kremlin. So give us your money. That's what Mother Jones and David Korn, who's become a Russiagate fraud in the Trump era.
Oh, he was horrible during the Bernie campaign. I actually almost came to blows with him in Philadelphia because he just was so biased against Bernie, and also Kevin Drum. And Clara Jeffries is now tweeting. She tweeted some graphic that was perceived to be, it was from the Phantom toll booth, but a lot of people thought it was like an anti-Semitic picture because it was an old man with a hooked nose.
Right.
So anyway, go on.
So then not only did they do this false flag operation, but they also opened a Facebook account and started reaching out to write-in Republican candidates. So like obscure people. This guy named Mac Watson, who's like a pool supply, backyard pool supply salesman, and he decided to be a write-in candidate. And so this New Knowledge reached out to him through an anonymous Facebook page and arranged interviews for him in the Montgomery Advertiser, the local paper in Alabama, as well as the Washington Post. And it was all part of a plot to basically shave votes, to divide the Republican vote, to shave votes away from Roy Moore. Now, this is an incredible development considering this is exactly what the Democratic establishment accuses Jill Stein of doing, of being the Russia-linked third-party spoiler, and there's this like cult of hatred for Jill Stein and the Green Party among the Clintonites. And so this is exactly what they did. So, the whole cult of hate for Jill Stein is this incredible projection of exactly what New Knowledge did with this Facebook page. And Mac Watson, was like, this is really weird. They even tried to arrange to have a super PAC for Mac Watson. And it came out even later, according to the New Knowledge internal report, that they actually tried to recruit people on the ground who knew Mac Watson personally. So, I mean, really, these are, shady black ops by career spies who have basically, honed their skills in the government and in, spy agencies. And, traditionally, you see these kinds of operations, the U.S. doing these in foreign countries, to meddle in elections all around the world and, covertly or overtly. But now we see in the Trump era, they're actually turning these against American citizens. And this New Knowledge operation is one of four operations that we know about, specifically in the Alabama election. So
now,
you want to talk about the New York Times reporter? Sorry.
Yeah, but I also wanted to ask you, didn't Reed Hastings fund this, the founder of LinkedIn, one of the big Democratic donors?
Yes, Reid Hoffman.
Yeah, Reed Hoffman, I'm sorry.
Yes.
Reed Hastings is the other guy. What did he say? And also, what did Jonathan Morgan say? I mean, he completely denied doing this, didn't he? I mean, didn't he have an incredibly incredulous tweet after this whole thing was exposed by, who is it, Scott Shane? Was that his name?
Yeah. Yes. Well, Scott, so it's really shady what happened here. So Scott Shane, I'll explain the Scott Shane part first. So Scott Shane is the New York Times reporter who exposed this last month in about on December 17th or 19th. And it turns out that Scott Shane actually sat on this story for at least about 2.5 months. Now, why? It's because he learned about it at an event put on by New Knowledge that he attended on invitation, and he signed a non-disclosure agreement with this group, and he spoke at the event. So he was an invited guest, not just a reporter there, who somehow got in. He was an invited guest, learned about this event, didn't talk about it for 2 months, and then Scott Shane went on to write about the Senate Intelligence Committee report that New Knowledge authored and didn't say anything about it. So this is, treating it as if, oh, these guys didn't just run this disinformation campaign. This is totally legitimate. The Senate Intelligence report is, should be taken very seriously by this organization, this spy outfit that, just ran this operation against the American people. And then he basically has totally he stayed silent about it. He said, oh, there's no problem with what I did. There's no conflict of interest. And what else does Scott Shane know that he legally cannot talk about because of this NDA, this non-disclosure agreement? So that's a very shady aspect, and shows that it's also establishment media and these kind of Russiagate reporters who are in on the whole thing, who are in on these spying operations and are totally okay with them, and think that they're acceptable. And then Reid Hoffman and Jonathan Morgan being the CEO of New Knowledge, and then Reid Hoffman, the billionaire co-founder of LinkedIn, he is the largest donor to the Democratic Party in the U.S. now, and he has his hands all over the place. He's funding charter schools and privatization efforts all around the country. Very close with Hillary Clinton. He was actually called, there's a great article about him that he was called, a friend of his called him the Koch brother of the left. And Reid Hoffman took offense to that term, not because he doesn't like being compared to the Koch brothers, but because he doesn't like being called a leftist. He's like more of a centrist.
Yeah.
So, I think it's a really apt description, but Reid Hoffman said, oh, I don't, I gave $100,000 to this, but I didn't know what my money was being used for. I didn't know about it, which, just deny is basically the strategy. And Jonathan Morgan also said, oh, I didn't have anything, I didn't know about this. It was, we were just, what Jonathan Morgan said is, we were just experimenting, trying to replicate the Russian tactics to see if it was possible to do that. Now, of course, as we talked about before, with what the Senate Intelligence Committee reports actually showed was there was no Russian tactics. There's no evidence for this whole Russian disinformation campaign. So it's like they're fighting it. We're trying to replicate this thing that never actually happened. So it's it's a total cop out.
Like it was, the Google executive said there were $46,000 spent on Google, and the Facebook executive said $100,000 spent on Facebook, and half of that was after the election. And as you said, the half that was during the election was mixed among several candidates, and much of it wasn't even political in nature. So it's just a big nothing burger as far as I'm concerned. Now, is this outfit been sufficiently shamed? Do you think they're going to now disappear from the public scene? Is anybody even quoting their BS anymore? And finally, did Rachel Maddow report on this story?
I was really wondering what would happen with New Knowledge, if they'd be like, we're just going to slink away and maybe the thing will shut down or something. But no, they're still at it. I actually, just a few minutes before we started, I looked. I found that they're on the BBC again. That they're now in. New knowledge is being taken totally seriously, as if nothing happened. It's all good. They didn't just run this disinformation campaign, and now they're back in media being treated as, you know, Russian disinformation experts. These actual, you know, kind of Democratic Party linked spies, disinformation operatives, are being treated as Russiagate experts. So, you know, no, it's sadly there's zero you know, zero repercussions, zero consequences for these guys, and they're just going to stay as, you know, fake experts, and continue to push this story. And no, I do not believe Rachel Maddow touched this with a 10-foot pole. I mean, she's.
Did you tweet it to her?
No, no, I could do that. See if she. I mean, she won't say. There's not a chance she would say anything. I don't know. I've given up on people like her. She's just a total propagandist. She's busy tweeting about how it's great that, you know, the CIA is, and all the intelligence agencies and the military-industrial complex is all run by women now. Like, that's some like feminist, you know,
yeah, right.
win.
Right. So now that we have women spooks.
Right.
Now, let me say, there was an article today, or was it yesterday, in The Intercept by Glenn Greenwald about the the other story about how these mysterious attacks on the Cuban diplomats is now traced to Russia. Can you talk a little bit about that BS story?
Well, that's been a really kind of interesting and hilarious story I've watched over the past year plus. Basically, what happened is, you know, as the Trump presidency began, you know, Trump was in Miami announcing that he's rolling back Obama's thaw policy with Cuba, and, you know, taking this hard stance against Cuba, and Fidel is a dictator, and this and that. And soon after, the U.S. embassy in Cuba starts saying, "Oh, our staff has become ill from some kind of sonic weapon that the Cubans are using in the embassy, and it's only affecting our diplomats." And so the Trump administration pulled their diplomats, the vast majority of the diplomats from Cuba, sent them back to Washington, and then expelled Cuban diplomats. So, you know, basically it was just to raise tensions. And it was all, you know, it's kind of a weird science fiction story. And then, you know, there are these investigations that start, and, you know, mainstream media, CNN, MSNBC, are all totally credulously reporting this as like this Cuban sonic weapon is, you know, being used to attack our diplomats. And, you know, it's, I mean, it sounds like something out of like a bad Cold War, like, you know, spy movie. And then months later, it expands to China. Now it's happening in China against American diplomats. And then a couple months later, oh, now they're saying it was done by Russia. So, you know, the Russians created this sonic weapon that only targets, you know, American diplomats in adversarial countries, you know, so in China and Cuba, and it just gets more and more absurd. And then it comes out a couple of days ago that there was a study. There have actually been a few studies debunking this, but the most recent one said, actually, no, these researchers have concluded that that the sounds that these diplomats were hearing that were making them dizzy and sick and nauseous and, you know, all out of sorts were actually crickets. Yeah. So it was literally just the sound of crickets. And the AP, the Associated Press, released a recording of these crickets, which is just this like high-pitched buzzing. So these crickets apparently are some like I don't know the like specific, you know, whatever breed of crickets, species of crickets, but apparently they're extremely loud, like louder than the crickets we typically hear, at least in like the West. I remember crickets growing up in Phoenix, and, you know, I'd hear them chirping all the time. They'd be annoying, but these, like, I read a quote where it's you know, if you're in a diesel truck driving 50 miles an hour, you can hear these crickets outside. So apparently they're very loud. It very well could be. You know, I mean, it's just crickets, and it's very loud, and that's what the recording was. And maybe the U.S., you know, just took these recordings of crickets and cooked them up and gave them to the press and said, "This is the sound." Well, these actually are crickets. That it's mating season for crickets. That's what the sound was. These researchers said. So it could be that like Putin is, controlling these crickets' libidos and like making them like extra horny, so they like chirp extra loud and drive the diplomats crazy. So it actually is a Russian plot.
Well, let's review here. Okay, so Mueller's been investigating for 2 years. They didn't have any proof that he colluded with Trump to hack into the DNC server. They have not made any of that connection, although there was some. I was at TYT today. I was on Aggressive Progressives, and as I was leaving, it said, "Breaking news, Manafort admits having conversations with Russia about, during campaign." Oh, my God. I'm just so sick of this already. I remember they tried to say that they invaded Vermont's electric grid. That turned out to be untrue. They said they hacked into C-SPAN to take over the airwaves. That turned out to be untrue. They hacked into election systems in 21 states. That turned out to be untrue. What have they actually done? Has there ever been any proof that Russia did anything?
No. I mean, not in terms of all this collusion. I mean, there's like, I don't know. What I think that no, there's no proof about Russia hacking the election or this or that. Or I mean, I think really what this is that the establishment, we are in a period of decline. The American empire is in decline, and so the establishment, kind of the neoliberals, neoconservatives are very angry about this. They don't know how to deal with it, and they don't know how to understand that Trump won. He legitimately won by our own election standards, how we elect people. And yes, he lost the popular vote, but he won the electoral college, and so he won. They don't know how to deal with that, and it's a very clear sign of an empire in decline when we, our establishment can't really conjure up a decent enough candidate to beat, a misogynist and likely rapist who, TV reality star who has, the charisma of like, my little toe. And so I think that frustration and that confusion is being projected onto, not much less even onto Trump, but actually onto foreign countries. So like saying, oh, this isn't because of our own internal political processes and our own internal problems, but it's because of this evil Russian or the evil Chinese or whatever it is. Some kind of like harping on like American xenophobia and racism and this whole anti-communist Cold War ideology that's just like kind of the American religion. And so all of this is projected onto a foreign country, and it's egged on by these for-profit spies and weapons manufacturers. And so really, no, there's no proof of Russia like interfering, meddling in our election. If you don't consider some Instagram posts about Yosemite Sam that are not actually related to the Russian government, that are from a private Russian troll farm. If you consider that, election interference, then okay. But no, there's no evidence, and I mean, it really just says everything about where this country is.
Yeah, and even if there were, we do that stuff all the time. I mean, look, we, Victoria Nuland basically fomented a coup in the Ukraine against the democratically elected president because he was friendly to Russia, and put in, this guy who was supported by neo-Nazis. Hillary Clinton did the same thing. She didn't help, and we don't even know if she aided the coup against Zelaya, which led to the, Honduran migrant situation that we have today. During Gorbachev's election, we actually sent, American advisors over there to run his campaign. So talk about interfering in election. We were actually running a foreign candidate's campaign. And he was like our puppet in terms of dismantling, the Soviet Union. And it led to the oligarchs and the problems that, we have now, or I should say they have now.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's no country in human history that has meddled, interfered, violently overthrown, bombed as the U.S. has. I mean, if we want to, let's imagine for a moment that, okay, Mueller finds the smoking gun and like Putin and Trump, actually colluded, and that's why Trump's in office. That pales in comparison to, say, what the U.S. did to Iraq. How about just bombing the hell out of the country and killing hundreds of thousands of people? Or maybe, what we did to Iran. I mean, it's like there are dozens and dozens of examples of foreign intervention. How about flooding Syria with weapons that ended up mostly in the hands of like Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda cutouts. I mean, it's laughable to be upset at even the possibility, even if it were true. It's laughable to be upset. And if I were living in one of these countries and I was like, oh man, please, I would say, please, someone interfere in the American election in order to get rid of these warmongers. It would be like a humanitarian act.
Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, please interfere to elect Bernie Sanders, or come on.
Yeah. Well, listen, it's time for us to go, but I wanted to give you the last word and let people know what you're working on next and what we could look forward to seeing from you on RT and on the Grayzone project.
Well, I'm going to continue to work on these kind of Russian disinformation, these alleged Russian disinformation plots. There's actually another one that we just learned about yesterday. I've been writing about another one that happened in Alabama. It's called the Dry Alabama campaign, where another group of spies posed as a prohibitionist Baptist group in order to get votes away from Roy Moore. They did this again, and then there's two other operations that we learned about. So I'm gonna write about these. I may end up publishing the Grayzone project. We shall see. And just check out my reports at Artie America. You can watch them on YouTube. We've been mostly kicked off of TV. We used to be on DirecTV, but we got kicked off. So yeah, just keep up with my work. Follow me on Twitter at Dan Cohen 3000, and please check out my Max Blumenthal's documentary Killing Gaza. You can watch for a couple $, at killinggaza.com.
Yeah, I've been meaning to watch that for a couple years now, and now that I've had you on the show, I definitely will. And I'll put the link to it in in the comments. So thank you very much. I'm going to let you go so I can promote my upcoming shows.
Thanks so much, Lauren.
Okay. I really need people to share this show. As I've told you, I get put in Facebook jail all the time. So if anybody wants to just pick a Facebook group or two and commit, I don't ask for money. I don't have a Patreon. All I ask of people is that they share the show if they like the content. And also, I'm going to be looking for some remote correspondence. I want to do more segments out in the field. And if you are an activist, if you're covering a protest or organizing a protest or a disruption or anything like that, wherever you are in the country or the world for that matter, because this is, Facebook is, feel free to contact me and maybe we could put you on as like a remote correspondent. Again, no pay, but it's a way to get more stuff covered, because the robust opposition is basically activists and organizers, progressive candidates, progressive legislators who fight neoliberalism in Los Angeles, California, the US, and around the world. So it's a big, big subject matter, and I need help with it. So that's the show, and thank you very much for watching. If you don't already follow me on Twitter, my handle is... So until tomorrow night, if you're not sick of me, keep fighting.